Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of Mindset Shift. The aim is still the same, to get people talking and to get minds changing. I'm still your host, Moblessing Chere, and with me as always is Tinatina Anthony. So on the previous episodes, we have been talking about vision, how it's developed, even the aftermath of vision. Today, we want to look at something completely different. We want to look at the system of Egypt and its context and how it's relevant to modern day Zimbabwe. Tinatinda, hello and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Mobi.
All right, Tino, so let's get right into it.
Yes.
What was the system of Egypt like?
All right, amazing. So if we look at it from a biblical perspective, we see that after Joseph had gone into the place of power and when he was operating within his gift and he was operating within that which God called him to become, there's a time that comes where a new Pharaoh arises within Egypt. A new Pharaoh that did not know of Joseph, a new Pharaoh that did not have any record of what Joseph had done. And what that Pharaoh did is he realized that the Israelites, which were the people that were represented by Joseph, they were expanding in terms of numbers. They were expanding in terms of their strength. And immediately when he realized that, he feared that since these people are rising in numbers and since these people are becoming a great nation, let us put them into captivity, lest they take over Egypt from us. So what happens that immediately the Egyptian system begins to put the Israelites within captivity. So what happens now in their captivity is these are people that had come through Joseph to solve a particular issue that existed within Egypt because a famine was coming. The Pharaoh had a problem, the Pharaoh had a dream. But now we see that because a new Pharaoh arises and forgets the track record that Joseph has gotten, now these people, they're in captivity. And we see that in their captivity, they were in slavery. So slavery in this instance was a limitation upon the Israelites as a people. Slavery was making them develop Egypt, but they were doing it under harsh conditions. And every single time when it seemed as if they were multiplying in terms of numbers, they were becoming a great nation. The Pharaoh in that particular system began to fear that these people are going to take over. So it means that the abilities of the Israelites, they were limited whilst they were in the system of Egypt. The expansion of the Israelites, they were limited because now they had a Lord above their own God. And this was a Lord that did not know their own God, meaning to say that even when it comes to the moral principle that was upon the Israelites, it became even difficult for them to practice the purposes of God because they had a system that was standing against the reality of how they believed. So this was a system that was limiting the people that are called the nation of God just because they were under a system that was stigmatizing them. And you will notice that even in Egypt, these people were growing in more numbers compared to the Egyptians. But we still find a minority group managing to make sure that they actually put a majority group into captivity. So there is so much that we ought to look at in this particular system that can reveal so many things that can transform our mentality and leave us in a place where we are able to also impact our nation.
All right, that's really interesting. Yes. So how can we liken, or how is it similar, the system of Egypt and modern day Zimbabwe and even Africa?
Amazing. So when I was actually looking into this, I remember when I was studying the life of the Egyptians and also studying how the Israelites were put into captive, I was quickly reminded of the time where we were in our colonial period, where we had the minority group managing to put us into captivity. Because at the time where we were colonized by the different European countries, as a continent and even as a country as Zimbabwe, you will notice that these are people that came into our land, and these people were a minority group. Having come as a minority group, what they did is they put us into a system of captivity. The system of captivity meant that everything that we were doing at that particular time was completely changed. And we had to inherit a new system, which was the system that the British people had brought, particularly in Zimbabwe, and the colonialists had brought in Africa as a context. So you're going to realize that we were actually building our own Africa. But in building our own Africa, we were not benefiting from that which we were using in terms of development. Because remember, when the white people came within Africa, they were utilizing the principles of development, but we were the ones that were used as labor. So as we were used as labor, our countries and our nations and our continent, it was expanding in terms of development. But the mistake that was going on, that we were stigmatized to benefit from the development that was going on. So we liken it to the Egyptian system, though it was different in terms of context of location. Since this time the Israelites were the ones that were in Egypt. But you're going to realize that their entrance into Egypt was to solve a particular problem that the Egyptians were facing, which was going to be a famine. So you realize that they had benefit because they had now been given land by the Pharaoh Pharaoh that existed within that system. But you still see the people that are causing change, the people that are being used to work. These are the same people that are now being limited by a system. These are the same people that are now being put into captivity by a system. So it is very, very easy for us now as Africans to actually see that there is biblical context in terms of where we've been through and where we are going. So you're also going to realize that now that these people existed within the system of Egypt, you realize that God, when he is delivering these people, he introduces a promised land, a destination that they were meant to reach, where they were going to expand beyond the limitation they'd been given by the Egyptians. So we will realize that even Africa today, there are so many insights, there are so many visions, there are so many places where we are supposed to get. This is the promised land, because Africa is meant to be a force to reckon with. It's meant to be something that people need to look at, because we have the resources, we have the numbers, we've got the brains, but we still haven't reached the point which is the promised land. So what we are trying to do is to see how one ought to be transformed now under the very system that existed where we were colonized, but we still remove and detach ourselves from the delimitations and everything that was put to let us down, and we expand in that type of line so that we also as Africans, we also as a Zimbabwean, reach a point that is called the promised land. And we are going to realize that for our context as Zimbabwe, our context as Africa, the promised land is not particularly a place we ought to reach, but it's rather a mental transformed era where we are going to reach there, and everybody is meant to utilize the resources that we have held as a country and utilize that to bring change and to bring a developed nation, which is going to be called the promised land for us.
Wow. So when you're speaking, you mentioned of transformation in that particular system. I'll have to take that as wisdom. So what was the wisdom in Egypt, if there was any?
Amazing. So we are going to realize that though Egypt was the system that was limiting the Israelites, there is so much that existed within Egypt that the Israelites had to learn from. It is the same thing with us today as a modern Zimbabwe and as a modern Africa. As much as we have the European standard that limited us, the European standard that caused havoc amongst us, but there is still a lot that we ought to learn from the system. Because even though this system was causing limitation, but this system was a productive system. This was a system that was producing results. So the constant allowance for them to produce results mean to say that though we are detaching ourselves from their limitation, though we are detaching ourselves from everything that they have done to make us a little nation, but we still need to learn from their principle, because it is their principle of productivity that if we capture it, then it becomes essential for us. We spoke about it in a previous episode where we spoke of the wisdom of the serpent. That though the serpent is actually an animal that we despise and has been used as a form of evil, but because there is the word of God behind its creation, there is still wisdom that has been deposited within it that we ought to learn from. So even though Egypt was a system that was against the people of God, but still Egypt held principles that showcase wisdom that can assist us. The same principles that exist, because though Egypt was against the people of God, but the Egyptians were created by the word of God. Meaning to say there is a principle that they captured in the atmosphere, they utilized that principle, and that principle actually began to work for them. So the first thing that we want to look at, especially when we talk of the system of Egypt, when it comes to the wisdom, the number one thing that we want to learn from, or that we need to look at in the Egyptian system, we need to look at, even as Africans, in the context of the Europeans that colonized us. Number one is the simple principle of inheritance. Now, inheritance, Mobi, as it has been highlighted within Africa, whenever we talk and we speak of inheritance, the thing that everybody is thinking of is wealth, where we say that because my father has worked for a particular time, and now that my father is no longer in the picture, what inheritance means for me as a son, for me as a daughter, is that my father leaves the wealth with me. And when we talk wealth, the things that we are talking about, especially in Africa, we are talking of cars, we are talking of buildings, we are talking of the estate of an individual. That's why you're going to see that in Africa, whenever a man dies, the fight is for the estate, the fight is for the wealth, the fight is for the cars, the fight is for the money. But you are going to realize that within the Egyptian system, inheritance was a bigger it was a bigger principle than just inheriting the wealth. Because when you inherit the wealth, but the wealth lands upon an individual that is not sensible, that wealth is going to be depleted. We see this in the prodigal son, where the prodigal son gets to a time where he says to his father, give me my portion of my inheritance. When he spoke inheritance there, his inheritance was limited to the materialistic wealth of the father. And when the son does get the inheritance, because he had not inherited the true wealth and the true wisdom of the father, he did get the materialistic wealth, but we see that after some time he depleted that which he had been given. So as Africans, it's important for us to understand how important the system of inheritance was. To see the power of the system of inheritance, we see this as to how the system was running. So maybe for 420 years, how many people died and how many people were born within a space of 420 years? But in the Egyptian system, whether people died and whether people were born, they grew up with the mentality that if we are the Egyptian, we are the masters. If we are Egyptians, we are masters. The same way how we went through two kinds of colonialism, where there was the first Chimrenga, there was the second Chimrenga. How many people and how many white people died within that space? But every child that was born into the system of the white people, into the system of the Egyptians, they were born knowing their masters. And yet for 420 years, amongst the Israelites, they also grew up being born and being told that they were slaves. So when a baby was born amongst the Israelites, the baby grew up with the mentality that they are a slave. And when the baby was born amongst the Egyptian baby grew up knowing that they are a master. So what kept them knowing their masters and what kept them knowing their slaves was the aspect of inheritance. The inheritance system occurs when you are able to pass on your belief and your mentality upon the next generation, which is one thing that we fail to do, especially as Africans. As Africans, we are more concerned about inheriting the materialistic wealth that a man has gotten. But not so many of us are willing to inherit the mentality, to a point that our parents, when they are at work, they believe they are working so as to leave an inheritance to their children. But when they go to work, the child does not have an ethic of work. If my father was waking up at 5 a.m. so that he starts his day to have a victorious day, the victorious day brought him $500, but my inheritance should not be just the 500, but should be the aspect of waking up at 5 a.m. Because true inheritance occurs when you can reciprocate and when you can reproduce a result that another man reproduced, which is what we are lacking in Africa. That is why you see that businesses will flourish now, but after 2 generations, they are dying. But if we go on to the Europeans, which are our former colonialists, you're going to realize that one business has been running for the past 1 century, and for the 1 century that it has been running, they've been reproducing results. And you see that in our aspect, in 10 years, the business is gone. This is because we have not mastered what true inheritance is. So when we say that we are building an inheritance for our children, what we are actually supposed to be doing is giving our children the convictions and the moral standpoint as to how to produce results. So that even if our children are not liking the idea of the business you started, but they got the principle behind making a business successful, so that even if they start a line of business different from the one that you started as a man and as a father, they can still be successful. Because we have children today that, because parents believe inheritance is about materials, they are trying to force their need and their love for a specific kind of business on their children. So you're going to see, because a father does farming, he immediately wants the child to become a farmer. But the problem with that is, if the child does not like farming, the moment you leave the farm with your son is going to destroy everything you've built in 2 years. Because you have not built a mentality in your son that you are supposed to build a mentality of business, not a mentality to run a farm. So it has also affected us, even as the young people, that when we look at our parents, what we are looking for is their materialistic gain. But what we are not looking for is what led to them producing these results. So as a successful man, when you leave a true inheritance, you have not just left the materialistic gains, but what you have left is the mentality. Now, what's the importance of the mentality, Mobi, when we look at inheritance? I'm going to give a very controversial example, but you're going to see how important that example is. Say my father was a thief. On the credit, my father was not a thief and is not a thief. But say my father was a thief. If my father starts stealing cars here in Bulawayo, he may start by stealing cars in Famona. But when he steals cars in Famona, he may realize that stealing the cars in Famona at 8 p.m. is not a good idea, because at 8 p.m. people will be what? Awake. So what he's going to do is, the first time he tries to steal at 8, he's going to be found and he's going to run away. But already by doing that, he's captured a mentality that in Famona I cannot go at what? At 8. Then he tries to go and steal in the rural areas. But when he steals cattle in the rural areas, he will realize that it is okay to steal at 8. Why is it okay? Because people in the rural areas, they don't stay up for long. So already my father, through experience, he now knows that in the rural areas I can go at 8, I can go at 9. In Famona, I'm supposed to go at 12 to steal. So his success in stealing is going to be seen by the number of cars that he has and the number of cattle that he has. So when my father is leaving an inheritance of being a thief to me as a son, he can pass down the cars and he can pass down the cattle. But the best thing for my father to do is to tell me that don't go to Famona at 8, go to Famona at 12. Don't go to the rural areas at 6, go there at 8. What he has given me is he's already given me a shortened period of experience through his experience. That's inheritance. So that means that his results that he managed to amass in 5 years, I can now get those results in 2 years, because he's given me his mentality of being a successful thief. So even if he doesn't give me his cars, by my first heist, I can steal 4 cars. Because I am moving and I'm riding upon an experience that my father left for me. So the Egyptians were so masterful in achieving this, to a point that after every generation, they multiplied exponentially in terms of their results. That's why you're going to see that when it started at year number 1, at year number 420, Egypt was a different country altogether. It was a very productive country altogether, to a point that every time when God wants to uplift a man in the Bible, financially and materialistically, God sends that man to Egypt. We see this in the life of Abraham, where Abraham is told that I am shifting you from your father's house and I'm taking you to a new country, and in that new country I'm going to bless you. But we see that when he is going, he goes with wealth. But where did this wealth come from? This wealth came when Abraham and Sarah went to the system of Egypt, to a point that he had to lie that Sarah was his sister and not his wife, afraid that they would take him. The Bible goes on to tell us in scripture that when he was now leaving, he was given wealth. So the wealth that he had gone for was found where? In Egypt, not amongst the people of God. Why? Because the people of God have not amassed to the system and the wisdom of Egypt. So though Egypt may not be of God, but Egypt contained wisdom that was placed by who? By God. So this was the system of inheritance. The second system, or the second principle of wisdom that we get in Egypt, it's called the wisdom of adaptation for innovation. Now, if you look at the system of the Egyptians, even if we trace it until modern history, closer to today, we are going to realize that some irrigation systems that were built, these irrigation systems were developed by the Egyptians. There is an Egyptian irrigation system called the Shadoof. That Shadoof was actually a particular irrigation system that was built because there was now a demand for food and a shortage of water. So what the Egyptians were able to do, even in their system, was every time when a problem was presented to them, they adapted to the current problem and utilized technology that was available for them to adapt to the problem and eventually introduce what we call innovation. So innovation is simply the ability to adapt to a new condition that makes you uncomfortable. One thing that we fail to do as Africans is to adapt to a condition. We will spend years complaining about that condition. We will spend years talking about that condition, but adapting to the condition so as to find results even when the condition is against us is something that the Egyptians were good at. And you're also going to see that that's exactly what the white people were able to do. When the white person left Europe, Moby, they did not have resources. When the white person left Europe, they did not have iron, they did not have gold. If you actually look at the historic trend of Europe as a nation, as a continent, they don't have resources. But they were able to master going into another country that has got resources and adapting to that country's needs, which is what we wanted as Africans, and then in that case be able to take their resources and take back to their country. So these people are very innovative, and it's important for us to adopt this system where we become innovative based on the problems that we are getting. But the problem with the people of God is when problems come, we go into the place of prayer and we remain there. When a problem arises, you go into the place of prayer to receive grace that will now allow you to bring a solution to the problem. So everything we think we are waiting for, it's not coming. The solution is hidden in the wisdom God has placed in you. We spoke about it that if you cannot solve a problem, you are not going to live a victorious life that is filled with wealth. So Egypt as a system, they understood how to adapt and to be innovative. The third thing that was so crucial in the system of Egypt that we ought to learn with when it comes to wisdom is maintenance and sustenance. That is one thing that Africans don't understand. That's why you see that in courts today, one of the biggest fights is when a man has a child with another woman and is taken to court to maintain his own child. After the pleasures of being with a woman, after producing a seed, you have to be dragged to court to maintain your own seed. It is a sign to show that you are not productive in your mentality and they lack wisdom in you. Because what happens is every time when you introduce something in this world, what keeps this thing going for years is maintenance. If you don't maintain something, you will lose it. If you don't maintain your household, you will lose it. If you don't maintain your wife, you will lose her. If you don't maintain your business, you will lose it. Maintaining a business is allowing it to continuously reproduce results. Maintenance is a principle of productivity. We see this in the Egyptian system, that for 420 years, these people had the same Egypt, but the same Egypt was still being feared by the Israelites because any system that kept Egypt going was maintained. If you move with a car, Moby, and you drive the car, at every given particular distance you've walked, it has to be serviced. The reason why you service a car is you are trying to make sure that that which has been working continuously can be given a reboot so that it can continue producing results. If you drive a car and you service it continuously, the car can go for 5 to 10 years. But if you drive a car and you don't service it, within 2 years that car is gone. So we need to assess as Africans, what's one of the biggest problems we've had is we've failed to maintain our development. That's why you see that the Africans' development is moving up until it gets to a climax, then it falls to the ground. Because we don't understand that that which we build has to be maintained to stay at the top. Strive Masiwa says that it is easy to get to the top, but staying there is very difficult. That's why you see in Africa, we always say they used to have, but now they don't have anymore. There is a song that has been trending in Zimbabwe where it says Mbinga yakasheka, where you were once rich, you were once producing results, you were once a great man, You were once a great lady. You were once, but what about now? You fail to do it today because you cannot maintain. And men that fail to maintain are men that don't know how it happened. There are men that if you ask him now, how did you build your business? He's going to tell you hard work. Hard work is not how you built your business. Tell me how you took A and B and got C. The reason why men cannot explain that is they don't even know how to maintain it, because you cannot maintain a formula that you never knew. In mathematics, the most difficult thing is prove how to get to the answer, not how to get to the answer. You can get to the answer, but prove how you got there. Because proving how you got there will allow you to sustain your mathematical ability to solve a problem. So maintenance is a very essential and very important thing. So these three things, if we actually assess them, this was something that kept Egypt for 420 years as masters. And it also kept the Israelites as slaves for 420 years, because they failed to have the wisdom to maintain. They failed to have the wisdom to sustain. They failed to have the system of inheritance that is true and that is not just linked to seeing material wealth. And remember, the Israelites had inheritance too, but they were inheriting sheep. So the father dies with 5 and the 5 become 2 each, because there are 2 males, and the male opens another family, starts another family, and the 5 sheep are now 3 there and 2 there until he has a child. Within 3 generations, there's only 1 sheep left. Because at some point you're going to get hungry, but it's because you never understood how to get the sheep. So these are some of the things that we ought to learn from the Egyptian system and the wisdom that it had.
Wow. That was a very packed answer, and people even got the do's and don'ts of stealing cars and cattle. So how do we then exit the system of Egypt but still hold on to the wisdom and the inheritance that you were talking about as we're moving towards the promised land?
Exiting Egypt, we need to accept that it's going to be a very difficult journey. The reason why it's going to be difficult is when you've exited a system that has been working upon you for 420 years, you've built a mentality around that system. So as you exit Egypt, it's going to be difficult because you may start from zero. Trying to adapt into a new environment is what we spoke about that you're supposed to learn from Egypt. But when you leave Egypt, never look back to Egypt, but at the same time, do not forget that Egypt had principles that you still need to respect. So when you are leaving Egypt, it's exactly what we did as Africa. We broke out of the system that the colonialists left for us. But we will realize that from that time, many African countries, they've got a lot of problems that they are facing in terms of how difficult the journey to the promised land is, to a point that sometimes some people prefer going back to the colonial period. But the moment in which you prefer going back, it means you don't trust your ability to get to the promised land. So when you are exiting, cut off completely from the system in terms of desiring to go back. But when you leave the system, go carrying their principles and utilize those principles to slowly but surely develop yourself unto the promised land. The Israelites, at any given time when they faced a problem, whilst they are going to the promised land, they would say to Moses, when we were in Egypt, we had. That's a big problem. You cannot go back into your place of captivity, but your captivity will always call you back. Because Adolf Hitler says that when a general removes and plucks off feathers from a chicken, the chicken is going to go away in pain. But the moment Adolf Hitler or the general begins to put crumbs on the ground, the same chicken that was plucked off and felt pain will come back and start to eat those crumbs. That's exactly what these systems have been doing to us as Africans. They've been leaving us with donations. They've been leaving us with painting their countries as if they're so good, leaving crumbs and wanting us to come back and feed on those crumbs, not knowing that this is the same system that caused our pain. So when you're exiting Egypt, remember, never look back. It's going to be difficult, but if you utilize their principles, you may realize that you can actually amass to wealth greater than theirs.
All right, just one last question before we close off. Is the promised land a physical place, or it's something that is attained or developed?
You develop yourself into the promised land. Because when you get to the promised land as the Israelites, you're going to realize there are giants in there. but Caleb and Joshua are going to bring a good report and say that we are able to get it. So the promised land can exist, but if you're not transformed enough to get there, you will never reach there. So the biggest thing for us to do is not to want to know where exactly it is in location, but to know where my transformed mind fits into what the promised land is supposed to look like. So it gives you a burden to find your position as an individual as to how are you going to reach Zimbabwe to the promised land. What role do you play? What role do you play? And what role do I play? And not always questioning the role of another individual. So we reach there by a transformed mentality, and this is exactly what we've been trying to do with Mindset Shift till date.
Thank you so much, Tino. It's always a pleasure. All right. And we have come to the end of today's episode. We hope that it served its purpose of getting us thinking. Share those thoughts with us. Get in touch with us on our social media platforms. It's by communications all throughout. And the easiest really is to get in touch with us on this very video that you're watching. Leave your comments, leave your thoughts on our comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others. And hit the notification bell so that you do not miss any episodes as they drop. And that's all from me today. Mo Blessing, your host. And from the rest of the production team, it's goodbye and God bless.